The first light of dawn spread across the mountains of Yellowstone National Park, casting a warm, golden glow over the pine forest. A thin layer of mist drifted through the trees while birds welcomed another peaceful morning. Park Ranger Daniel Brooks, a 40-year-old veteran ranger, slowly drove his pickup truck along a narrow dirt road toward Black Wolf Ridge, one of the most remote areas of the park. Beside him sat his partner, Max, a 6-year-old German Shepherd known throughout Yellowstone for his remarkable tracking abilities. Over the years, Max had helped rescue dozens of lost hikers, located injured campers, and even detected wildfires before anyone else noticed them. To Daniel, Max was far more than a working dog. He was a trusted partner. After parking near an old trailhead, Daniel checked his backpack radio GPS and first aid kit before clipping Max's leash onto his harness. "Just another patrol," he said with a smile. Max wagged his tail once as they entered the forest. For nearly an hour, everything seemed perfectly normal. A family of elk crossed a nearby meadow. Cold water rushed through a narrow creek. The fresh scent of pine filled the mountain air. Daniel stopped occasionally to record storm damage from the previous night's rain, while Max quietly walked a few steps ahead. Without warning, Max froze. His ears stood straight. His nose lifted into the air. Daniel looked up. "What is it, Max?" The German Shepherd didn't move. Instead, he stared toward a section of dense forest far away from the marked trail. Daniel followed his gaze. He saw nothing unusual. No hikers, no wildlife, no smoke, no movement. He gently pulled on the leash. "Come on." Max refused. A moment later, he barked. Once. Then again. The sound echoed through the silent valley. Daniel immediately became alert. Max almost never barked without a reason. He trusted the dog's instincts. Still, he carefully searched the area through his binoculars. Nothing. Even the ground showed no fresh footprints or animal tracks. Everything appeared completely normal. Daniel tried leading Max back toward the official trail. They had barely walked 20 feet when Max suddenly pulled hard on the leash. Daniel nearly stumbled. The dog wanted to return to the same direction. This time, he was even more determined. Daniel hesitated for several seconds. Finally, he unclipped the leash. "If you think something's there." Max immediately sprinted into the forest. Daniel hurried after him. They pushed through thick bushes, climbed over fallen trees, crossed a shallow stream, and continued uphill across rough, rocky ground. The farther they traveled, the steeper the terrain became. Soon, Daniel noticed they had left every marked ranger route behind. Even the GPS signal began cutting in and out. "Where are you taking me?" Daniel asked, breathing heavily. Max never looked back. Nearly 40 minutes later, the German Shepherd suddenly stopped at the base of a towering cliff covered with moss and tangled vines. Then he began digging furiously. Daniel stepped closer. Curious, he pulled away several thick vines hanging across the rock face. His eyes widened. Hidden beneath decades of vegetation was a narrow opening just large enough for one person to enter. It looked exactly like the entrance to a cave. Daniel quickly opened an old geological map stored in his backpack. After checking the coordinates twice, he stared silently at the faded words printed across the paper. Bear Echo Cave. According to Yellowstone's records, the cave had collapsed during the massive earthquake 50 years earlier. No ranger had entered it since. Daniel slowly lowered the map. Max stood perfectly still, staring into the darkness beyond the entrance. He wasn't barking anymore. He simply watched the cave, as if he already knew something inside was waiting for them. Daniel stood silently at the entrance of Bear Echo Cave, unable to take his eyes off the narrow opening hidden behind decades of vines and moss. According to every official map, this cave had collapsed 50 years ago after a powerful earthquake. Since then, no ranger had reported finding another entrance, yet Max had led him here without hesitation. Daniel switched on his flashlight and stepped closer. A cool breeze drifted out of the darkness, carrying the smell of damp stone. He knelt beside the entrance and carefully examined the ground. There were no recent human footprints, no discarded equipment, no signs that anyone had been there for years. "Strange," he whispered. Max remained completely focused on the cave. His ears stayed forward while his nose continuously sampled the air. Daniel trusted his partner. Before going any farther, he radioed the ranger station. "This is Ranger Daniel Brooks. I've located what appears to be an unrecorded entrance to Bear Echo Cave." A few seconds of static followed. Then dispatch replied, "Repeat that, Daniel." "I believe I've found Bear Echo Cave." The dispatcher paused. "That cave has been sealed for 50 years. "I know, but I'm looking at the entrance right now." Another brief silence followed. "Stand by. We'll notify Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell." Daniel glanced at the sky. Dark clouds were beginning to gather above the mountains. A summer storm could arrive much sooner than expected. The radio crackled again. "Daniel, Chief Mitchell wants you to wait until another team arrives." Daniel looked toward Max. The German Shepherd hadn't moved. Instead, he took 2 slow steps into the entrance before stopping again. Then he looked back at Daniel, not impatient, almost inviting him to follow. Daniel hesitated. He had worked with Max for 6 years. Whenever Max behaved this way, there was always a reason. He pressed the radio button again. "I'm only going to inspect the first section. I'll stay close to the entrance." "Understood," the dispatcher replied, "but don't take unnecessary risks." Daniel clipped a safety rope to a large pine tree outside the cave before fastening the other end around his waist. After checking his flashlight one last time, he nodded toward Max. "Let's go." The cave swallowed them almost immediately. Sunlight faded behind them as cool darkness surrounded the narrow passage. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. Every footstep echoed through the silent cavern. The tunnel was surprisingly stable. Although large cracks covered many of the walls, the ceiling appeared solid. Daniel carefully studied the rock formations. "It doesn't look like a complete collapse," he murmured. "Maybe only the old entrance was buried." Max continued walking several feet ahead. Every few moments he stopped to sniff the ground before moving again. After nearly 10 minutes, the passage widened into a large underground chamber. Daniel slowly turned his flashlight. Ancient limestone walls stretched high above him. Huge rock columns rose from the cave floor. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. Then his light stopped on something unexpected, a rusty metal sign, half buried beneath fallen rocks. Daniel brushed away the dirt. The faded words were still readable. U.S. Geological Survey. Below it was a date, 1976. Daniel frowned. That wasn't possible. If no one had entered the cave for 50 years, why was there equipment from nearly 30 years after the earthquake? Before he could think further, Max suddenly froze. His ears lifted. He sniffed the air once more. Then he began walking deeper into the cave. This time, much faster. "Max," Daniel called. The German Shepherd didn't stop. A few seconds later, he disappeared around a bend in the tunnel. Daniel hurried after him. As he rounded the corner, he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow taps echoed somewhere in the darkness. Daniel immediately switched off his flashlight. The cave became silent. Again, knock, knock, knock. Someone was making that sound. Daniel's heart began to race. According to every official record, no one had entered Bear Echo Cave in half a century. So who was still inside? Daniel remained perfectly still. The cave was silent once again. His flashlight stayed switched off as he listened carefully. Then the sound came back. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow taps. Not rocks falling. Not dripping water. It was deliberate. Someone was making that sound. Daniel turned his flashlight back on and immediately radioed the ranger station. "This is Daniel Brooks. I think I hear someone inside the cave." The dispatcher sounded surprised. "Did you say someone?" "Affirmative. I can't confirm yet, but the sound is repeating." The reply came almost instantly. "Chief Mitchell and the rescue team are on their way. Estimated arrival 30 minutes. Daniel looked around the enormous chamber. 30 minutes could be a very long time if someone inside was injured. He glanced at Max. The German Shepherd stood completely still, staring toward a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. "Lead the way." Max moved forward without hesitation. The passage became tighter with every step. Loose rocks covered the ground, forcing Daniel to move carefully. Every few yards, he placed a small fluorescent trail marker on the cave wall so the rescue team could follow later. After several minutes, the tunnel opened into another chamber. Daniel swept his flashlight across the room. Broken wooden crates, rusted climbing equipment, a collapsed workbench. Everything was covered in decades of dust. "This must have been an old research station," Daniel whispered. Max ignored everything around him. His nose stayed close to the ground as he followed a scent toward another narrow opening. Daniel followed closely behind. The farther they went, the stronger the cool air became. That surprised him. A steady airflow usually meant there was another opening somewhere deeper inside the cave. Suddenly Max stopped. He lifted his head, then barked once. A weak voice answered from somewhere ahead. "Hello." Daniel froze. He had heard it clearly this time. A human voice. "Can you hear me?" Daniel shouted. Several seconds passed. Then came the reply. "Please, I'm here. It's dark." Daniel hurried toward the sound. The passage curved sharply before opening into a small chamber filled with fallen rocks. His flashlight quickly found the source. An elderly man was sitting against the cave wall. His clothes were covered in dust. His beard was gray. A climbing helmet rested beside him. One of his legs was trapped beneath several large rocks. The man blinked as the flashlight reached his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel knelt beside him. "My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm a Yellowstone Park ranger." The old man smiled weakly. "I knew someone would come." Daniel immediately checked his condition. The man was exhausted and badly dehydrated, but he was conscious. His pulse was weak but steady. Max slowly walked over and gently rested his head on the man's shoulder. The elderly explorer smiled again. "So, it was the dog." Daniel nodded. He found the cave. The old man reached out with trembling fingers and softly stroked Max's neck. "I heard him barking. I prayed. It wasn't just my imagination." Daniel opened a bottle of water and helped the man drink a few small sips. "My name is Henry Lawson," the man said quietly. "I came here 4 days ago." Daniel looked surprised. 4 days, Henry nodded. "I wasn't exploring. I came back." "Back?" Henry slowly pointed toward a weathered leather backpack lying nearby. "My father worked in this cave. He was a geologist. He died, believing his final research had been lost forever." Daniel listened carefully. "I wanted to find it. I promised him I would." Before Daniel could ask another question, a deep rumble echoed through the cave. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Both men looked up immediately. Another rumble followed. Small stones bounced across the floor. Daniel's expression became serious. The storm. Heavy rain outside was already soaking the mountainside. Water was beginning to seep through cracks in the cave ceiling. If the rain continued, unstable sections of the tunnel could collapse again. Daniel grabbed his radio. "Rescue team, this is Brooks. I've located a survivor. Male, approximately 70 years old, trapped with a leg injury. We need extraction immediately." The response came a second later. "We're entering the cave now. Hold your position." Daniel looked toward the narrow passage behind them. Then, at the ceiling, the shaking had stopped. For now. Max, however, wasn't watching the tunnel. He had walked toward the far corner of the chamber. He began sniffing a large stone wall with unusual intensity. Then he pawed at the ground. Once. Twice. Daniel frowned. "What is it, Max?" The German shepherd barked softly and continued scratching the same spot, half buried beneath years of dust. Daniel noticed the edge of an old metal box protruding from beneath the rocks. Daniel carefully brushed away the dust surrounding the object Max had uncovered. Little by little, the outline of an old metal box appeared beneath the loose rocks. Rust covered nearly every inch of its surface, but the lid remained intact. "It looks like it's been here for decades," Daniel murmured. Max sat quietly beside the box, watching every movement. The elderly man smiled weakly. "I've been looking for that." Daniel turned toward him. "You knew it was here," Henry Lawson nodded. "My father wrote about it in his journal. He believed the research team hid something important before the earthquake." Daniel gently lifted the box. It was surprisingly heavy. A faded government emblem was still visible on the lid. along with the words United States Geological Survey. Using a small multi-tool, Daniel carefully pried the rusty latch open. Inside were several waterproof notebooks, old geological maps, a compass, and dozens of black and white photographs sealed inside protective sleeves. Everything had been preserved remarkably well. Henry's eyes filled with emotion. My father's notes. I thought they were gone forever. Daniel carefully handed him one of the journals. The old man slowly turned the brittle pages. Inside were detailed sketches of the cave system, handwritten observations and measurements dating back more than 50 years. Then something slipped from between the pages. A folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age but remained readable. Henry unfolded it with trembling hands. For several moments he simply stared. Daniel remained silent. Finally, Henry smiled sadly. It's my father's handwriting. He began reading quietly. If someone finds these notes one day, it means the mountain has finally allowed us to return. This cave still has many secrets. Protect them. Nature always deserves our respect. Henry lowered the letter. He never cared about fame. He only wanted future rangers and scientists to understand this place. Daniel carefully examined the maps. One drawing immediately caught his attention. Several unexplored tunnels extended far beyond the chamber where they were standing. Yet none of them appeared on any modern Yellowstone map. This changes everything, Daniel whispered. Before he could study the map further, his radio crackled. Daniel, this is Chief Mitchell. We're about 5 minutes away. We've reached the main chamber. Daniel immediately answered. We've located the survivor. And we've also found old geological survey records. There was a brief pause. Copy that. Secure everything. We'll evaluate the site after the rescue. As Daniel placed the journals back into the metal box, Max suddenly stood up. His ears pointed toward the tunnel behind them. He growled softly, not in fear, in warning. Daniel switched off his flashlight for a moment. The cave became completely silent. Then he heard it, a low cracking sound. The ceiling. Tiny stones began falling from above. Henry looked up nervously. The mountain. It's moving. Another rumble echoed through the chamber. This one was much louder. Daniel knew exactly what it meant. The heavy rain outside was loosening unstable rock formations. The cave could collapse again at any moment. He grabbed his radio. Chief Mitchell, we need to move now. The ceiling is becoming unstable. We're almost there, came the reply. Hold on. Daniel looked at Henry's trapped leg. Several large rocks still pinned it to the ground. There was no time to wait. He removed a compact hydraulic rescue jack from his emergency pack. We're going to lift these rocks together. Henry nodded despite the pain. Daniel positioned the jack beneath the largest boulder and slowly pumped the handle. The rock shifted. Only a few inches, but it was enough. With one final effort, Daniel pulled the smaller stones away while Henry carefully slid his injured leg free. At that exact moment, Max barked sharply. Once, twice. Daniel looked toward the tunnel. Bright flashlight beams appeared in the darkness. Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell and 4 rescue specialists rushed into the chamber carrying medical equipment and a rescue stretcher. You found him, Susan said with relief. Daniel smiled. No, he looked down at Max. He found us. As the rescue team began treating Henry, Susan noticed the old metal box. What is that, Daniel? Carefully opened the lid. Susan's eyes widened as she saw the journals and maps. Incredible. We've been searching for these historical records for years. Henry gently placed his father's letter back inside. My father always believed someone would return. Daniel closed the lid. He was right. Just then another powerful rumble shook the chamber. A long crack raced across the ceiling. Everyone froze. Small rocks rained onto the cave floor. Susan immediately raised her voice. We're leaving. Right now. Max turned toward the exit without waiting for another command. He had already found the path home. The moment Susan Mitchell gave the order, the rescue team moved into action. 2 paramedics carefully secured Henry Lawson onto a rescue stretcher, while another ranger packed the weathered metal box into a waterproof evidence case. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. Inside the cave, the rumbling grew louder. Daniel looked toward the ceiling. Long cracks stretched across the limestone above them. We have to keep moving, he said. Susan nodded. No stops. The team began making its way back through the narrow tunnel. 2 rescuers carried Henry. Daniel walked beside them. Max immediately took the lead. The German Shepherd moved with complete confidence, following the same route he had used to reach the trapped explorer. Every few yards he paused, checked the air, and continued forward. The cave seemed different now. Small rocks rolled across the ground. Dust drifted constantly from the ceiling. Water trickled through cracks that had been dry only an hour earlier. Daniel glanced behind him. The chamber where they had found Henry was already disappearing into darkness. A sudden crash echoed through the tunnel. Everyone froze. Several large rocks fell behind the rescue team, blocking part of the passage they had just crossed. Susan took a deep breath. Good thing we didn't wait. The team continued moving. After another 10 minutes, they reached a narrow section where the ceiling dropped to just over 6 feet. The rescuers slowed down to maneuver the stretcher carefully. Suddenly, Max stopped. His ears stood upright. He sniffed the air. Then he barked sharply. Daniel immediately recognized the warning. What is it? Instead of moving forward, Max stepped backward. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling ahead. Daniel aimed his flashlight upward. A large crack ran across the rock directly above the tunnel. Water poured steadily through it. Without warning, a football-sized stone crashed onto the ground exactly where the lead rescuer had been about to step. Everyone back. The team quickly retreated several feet. Only seconds later, a section of the ceiling collapsed, filling the tunnel with dust and broken limestone. When the air finally cleared, the path ahead was completely blocked. No one spoke. Susan studied the fallen rocks. This wasn't on the way in. Daniel nodded. The storm made it unstable. One of the rescuers looked worried. If this is blocked, how do we get out? Daniel unfolded one of the old cave maps they had recovered from the metal box. His flashlight swept across the faded lines. There may be another route. Henry slowly opened his eyes from the stretcher. My father. He mentioned an emergency passage. Daniel looked at him. Do you remember where Henry closed his eyes for a moment, then pointed weakly toward the left side of the tunnel? There should be a narrow passage behind a limestone wall. The team immediately began searching. For several minutes, they found nothing. Solid rock surrounded them. Then, Max walked to a section of the wall covered with thick mineral deposits. He sniffed once, twice, then placed both front paws against the stone. Daniel stepped beside him. The rock sounded hollow when he tapped it. Help me. 2 rescuers grabbed pry bars from their equipment packs. Working together, they removed several loose stones. A narrow opening slowly appeared. Cool, fresh air drifted through it. Susan smiled. We found it. The emergency passage was much smaller than the main tunnel. Only one person could pass at a time. The rescuers carefully lifted Henry's stretcher sideways and slowly guided it through the opening. The route climbed steadily upward. Although exhausting, it remained stable. After nearly 20 minutes of climbing, everyone noticed something. The air felt warmer. Daylight. Daniel switched off his flashlight. A faint beam of natural light shone through a crack ahead. We're close. Max suddenly accelerated. He squeezed through the final opening and disappeared outside. A second later, Daniel heard him barking. Not in warning. In excitement. One by one, the rescue team emerged from the mountainside. Fresh air rushed into their lungs. Rain had finally stopped. Golden sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the forest below. Several rescue vehicles were already waiting. Medical crews hurried toward Henry. As the paramedics loaded him into an ambulance, Henry reached for Daniel's hand. I wouldn't be alive without your partner. Daniel looked toward Max. The German Shepherd was sitting quietly on a large rock overlooking the valley. His ears twitched as the wind carried the scent of pine through the mountains. Susan walked over holding the metal evidence case. You realize what we found today, Daniel nodded. A forgotten cave, Susan smiled. Much more than that. We may have discovered one of the most important historical geological sites in Yellowstone. Daniel looked back at the hidden cave entrance high on the cliff. For 50 years, the mountain had kept its secrets, and somehow A 6-year-old German Shepherd had found the only way back inside. By late afternoon, the rescue operation had officially ended. The entrance to Bear Echo Cave was secured with temporary barriers while geologists inspected the surrounding cliffs for signs of further collapse. News of the dramatic rescue spread quickly throughout Yellowstone National Park. Everyone wanted to know how a 6-year-old German Shepherd had led rangers to a cave that had remained hidden for half a century. But Daniel wasn't thinking about the headlines. He couldn't stop thinking about the journals they had recovered. Inside the park's research center, the weathered notebooks were carefully laid across a large examination table. Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell, 2 geologists, a park historian, and Daniel gathered around while conservators gently turned the fragile pages. The journals were filled with maps, sketches, geological observations, and handwritten notes dating back more than 50 years. One notebook immediately caught Daniel's attention. Unlike the others, it contained personal entries instead of scientific records. Henry Lawson smiled faintly. My father wrote in that journal every evening. He believed every expedition should leave behind a story, not just data. The historian carefully opened the final pages. Tucked inside was another folded sheet of paper. It had never been opened. Susan carefully unfolded it. At the top was a handwritten title, "To the Ranger Who Finds This." The room fell silent. Susan began reading aloud. If you are reading this, the cave has welcomed visitors once again. Please remember that this mountain is not something to conquer. Protect it with wisdom, and it will continue protecting those who come after us. Nature is never our enemy. It only asks to be respected. Daniel lowered his eyes. Those words felt less like a scientific note and more like a message passed from one generation of rangers to the next. Henry quietly wiped away a tear. That sounds exactly like my father. He loved this park more than anything. Just then, one of the geologists looked up from another notebook. Daniel, you should see this. He pointed to an old hand-drawn map showing several underground chambers connected to Bear Echo Cave. One chamber had been circled in red. Next to it, someone had written only 6 words. Protected habitat. Never enter again. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? The geologist shook his head. We don't know. There are no reports about this chamber anywhere in the park archives. Susan closed the journal thoughtfully. Whatever they found, they deliberately kept it secret. Daniel looked at Max, who was lying quietly near the doorway after the long day. The German Shepherd slowly lifted his head, almost as if he understood the conversation. Daniel smiled. I have a feeling our adventure isn't over yet. Outside, the evening sun disappeared behind the mountains. Far above the forest, hidden beneath layers of ancient stone, Bear Echo Cave still held secrets that no one had uncovered. And somehow, Max had only discovered the first one. The following morning, Bear Echo Cave remained closed to the public. Yellowstone officials had sealed the entrance while engineers examined the mountain for additional structural damage. Only a small team of authorized personnel was allowed back inside. Daniel Brooks was one of them. Standing beside him were Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell, 2 geologists, Henry Lawson and Max. Henry pointed to the hand-drawn map recovered from his father's journal. The hidden chamber should be somewhere beyond the second underground passage. Susan looked at the engineers. Is it safe enough? One of them nodded. For a limited inspection, no more than 2 hours. Daniel adjusted his backpack. Let's move. The team entered the cave once again. This time, the atmosphere felt different. They were no longer searching for a missing person. They were following the final clue left behind more than 50 years ago. Max led the group through the familiar passages until they reached the large chamber where Henry had been rescued. From there, the old map guided them into a tunnel no one had noticed before. It was narrow and partially hidden behind fallen rocks. The deeper they walked, the quieter the cave became. Even the dripping water seemed to disappear. Only the sound of their footsteps echoed through the darkness. After nearly 30 minutes, Max suddenly slowed down. He sniffed the air carefully before stopping beside a massive limestone wall. Daniel compared the location with the map. We're here. The geologist began examining the rock surface. At first, everything appeared solid. Then, one of them noticed several straight lines crossing the stone. They're not natural. Someone had carefully stacked these rocks by hand decades earlier. Using small tools, the team removed the loose stones one by one. A narrow doorway slowly appeared. Cool air drifted from the opening. Henry stared silently. My father sealed this place. He never wanted anyone to damage it. Susan switched on a stronger flashlight. The team stepped inside. Unlike the rest of the cave, this chamber was untouched. The walls sparkled with thousands of crystal formations. Delicate mineral columns rose from the floor. Small underground pools reflected the light like mirrors. No footprints marked the soft ground. It looked exactly as it had half a century earlier. Everyone stood in complete silence. One geologist finally whispered, "This is extraordinary." Daniel slowly walked forward. Near the center of the chamber stood a weathered wooden marker. It carried only a small brass plate. The engraving was still readable. Protected Scientific Preserve Do Not Disturb 1976. Daniel looked toward Henry. So this was the secret. Henry nodded. My father discovered a rare underground ecosystem. He believed tourism would destroy it. Susan slowly smiled. He wasn't hiding treasure. He was protecting nature. One of the biologists carefully examined the underground pools. Tiny pale creatures moved beneath the crystal clear water. Blind cave salamanders. Several rare cave insects, species that had survived in complete darkness for generations. The scientists looked up with excitement. Some of these may never have been officially documented. Daniel understood immediately why Henry's father had chosen secrecy. If word spread decades earlier, thousands of curious visitors might have entered the cave. The fragile habitat would have disappeared within a few years. Just then, Max quietly walked toward one corner of the chamber. He sat down. Instead of barking, he simply looked upward. Daniel followed his gaze. High on the wall was another small brass plaque, almost completely hidden by mineral deposits. He carefully brushed away the crystals. A single sentence appeared. The greatest discovery is knowing when not to disturb what nature has protected. Nobody spoke. The words perfectly reflected everything Henry's father had believed. Susan closed her notebook. This chamber won't become a tourist attraction. It will remain exactly as he wanted. Henry smiled through tears. My father finally kept his promise. Daniel gently rested a hand on Max's neck. If Max hadn't trusted his instincts, none of us would ever have found this place. The German shepherd quietly wagged his tail. He didn't understand the praise. He had simply followed a scent. But that instinct had reunited a son with his father's legacy, saved a man's life, and protected one of Yellowstone's greatest hidden treasures. The discovery inside Bear Echo Cave quickly became one of the most important events in Yellowstone National Park's recent history. However, unlike most remarkable discoveries, very little information was released to the public. The National Park Service announced only that a historic geological site had been rediscovered and that the area would remain permanently protected. The exact location was removed from all public maps. Daniel agreed with the decision. Some places were simply too fragile to become tourist attractions. Over the next several days, scientists carefully documented every corner of the hidden chamber. Instead of removing specimens, they relied on high-resolution photography, laser scanning, and environmental sensors to study the cave without disturbing its ecosystem. Henry Lawson remained at the park after leaving the hospital. Although his injured leg still required a walking stick, he insisted on helping the research team interpret his father's journals. One afternoon, Daniel found Henry sitting outside the ranger station, quietly reading the old notebook. Max lay beside him in the warm sunshine. Henry smiled as Daniel approached. "I've finally finished reading every page." Daniel pulled up a chair. "Did you find anything else?" Henry nodded. "My father wasn't searching for fame. He was trying to teach future rangers something." He handed Daniel the final page of the journal. Written near the bottom was one last sentence. "The greatest guardians of nature are those who protect it without expecting recognition." Daniel read the words twice before carefully closing the journal. "I think every new ranger should read this." A few days later, Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell organized a small ceremony at Yellowstone's Ranger Training Center. There were no television cameras, no reporters, only park staff, scientists, volunteers, and a handful of local residents. On a wooden table rested the weather journals, the old geological maps, and several photographs taken inside the cave. Susan stepped forward. For more than 50 years, these records were believed to be lost forever. Today, they have finally returned home. Everyone applauded. Susan then turned toward Daniel. "Ranger Brooks, you followed your partner when every map said the cave no longer existed." Daniel smiled. "I trusted Max." Susan looked down at the German shepherd sitting proudly beside him, and that trust saved a life. The audience applauded once again. A young ranger approached Max and gently scratched behind his ears. "I hope one day I have a partner like him." Daniel laughed softly. "You don't find a partner like Max, you earn one." Later that afternoon, the National Park Service presented Max with a special medal recognizing his extraordinary service. The medal was attached to a new leather collar, handcrafted by a local ranger using traditional techniques. As Daniel fastened it around Max's neck, the German shepherd simply wagged his tail, completely unaware that he had become a hero. To him, it had been just another day working beside his best friend. Before sunset, Daniel and Max returned one final time to the overlook above Bear Echo Cave. The mountains glowed orange beneath the evening sky. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine across the valley. Daniel sat quietly on a large rock, while Max rested beside him. After a long silence, Daniel looked toward the hidden cave. "Some secrets were never meant to be owned," he said softly. "They were meant to be protected." Max lifted his head and looked toward the distant cliffs. The cave would remain hidden once again. Not because people couldn't find it, but because they had chosen to respect it. Daniel smiled and gently placed a hand on Max's shoulder. "Come on, partner. We've still got a park to protect." Together they walked back down the mountain as the last light of day faded over Yellowstone. Some adventures ended with treasure. Others ended with fame. But this one ended with something far more valuable, a rescued life, a father's legacy fulfilled, and the reminder that the greatest discoveries are often the ones we choose to preserve rather than possess. Several weeks passed after the discovery of Bear Echo Cave. The hidden chamber remained closed under permanent protection, and only a small group of researchers was granted access each year to monitor its delicate ecosystem. Life in Yellowstone gradually returned to normal. Daniel, Brooks, and Max resumed their daily patrols across the vast wilderness, responding to injured wildlife, assisting lost hikers, and keeping visitors safe. Yet something had changed. Wherever they went, people recognized Max. Children visiting the park often waved excitedly when they saw the German shepherd riding beside Daniel in the ranger truck. Many had heard the story of the dog that had led rescuers to a cave forgotten for 50 years. One quiet afternoon, Daniel received a message from Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell. "Can you stop by the visitor center? I have something I'd like you to see." An hour later, Daniel and Max walked into the newly renovated Yellowstone Visitor Center. Several park employees smiled as Max entered. "Good afternoon, buddy," one ranger greeted, kneeling to scratch behind Max's ears. Susan was waiting near a large display covered with a cloth. "You arrived just in time." Daniel looked around. "What's going on?" Susan smiled. "We wanted to thank someone." She slowly pulled away the cloth. Behind it stood a beautiful wooden exhibit featuring photographs from the rescue mission. There were pictures of Daniel Henry Lawson, the research journals, and Bear Echo Cave. At the center of the display was a large photograph of Max standing proudly at the cave entrance on the morning everything began. Beneath the photograph was a bronze plaque. It read, "Max, German Shepherd, age 6, Park Ranger Partner. His instincts saved a life, preserved an irreplaceable scientific treasure, and reminded us that the greatest guides are often those who cannot speak." Daniel stared silently at the plaque. He hadn't expected anything like this. Susan stepped beside him. "Every visitor who walks through this building will know what Max did." Daniel looked down at his partner. Max simply sat calmly, completely unaware that the exhibit had been created in his honor. A few moments later, Henry Lawson entered the visitor center using his walking stick. His injured leg had improved considerably. In his hands, he carried a small wooden box. "I have one last gift," he said. Daniel accepted the box and carefully opened it. Inside was an old silver ranger badge. Henry smiled. It belonged to my father. He always believed that protecting nature was the greatest responsibility a person could have. I think he would have wanted you to keep it. Daniel gently shook his head. I didn't earn this. Henry looked toward Max. Maybe not. But together, both of you did. Daniel accepted the badge with quiet gratitude. Later that evening, he attached it inside the ranger station beside photographs of former Yellowstone Rangers who had dedicated their lives to the park. As the sun began to set, Daniel and Max drove toward one of their favorite overlooks. The mountains glowed beneath the golden evening light. The forest stretched endlessly below. Daniel stepped out of the truck and leaned against the hood. Max sat beside him watching a herd of elk slowly crossing the valley. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Finally, Daniel smiled. You know, I've been called the hero of that rescue. He laughed softly. They're wrong. Max looked up at him. If you hadn't stopped that morning, I'd have driven right past the trail. The cave would still be hidden. Henry might never have made it home. The German shepherd gently rested his head against Daniel's hand. Daniel scratched behind his ears. Good job, partner. As darkness slowly settled across Yellowstone, the stars began appearing one by one above the mountains. Tomorrow would bring another patrol, another trail, another unknown adventure waiting somewhere in the wilderness. Daniel knew one thing for certain. As long as Max walked beside him, no path would ever truly be unexplored. Months later, life in Yellowstone National Park had returned to its peaceful rhythm. Bear Echo Cave remained permanently protected, and the fragile underground ecosystem was preserved exactly as Henry Lawson's father had hoped more than 50 years earlier. The journals were safely displayed in the park's historical archive, where future rangers and researchers could study them without disturbing the cave itself. Henry visited the park one final time before returning home. Standing beside Daniel and Max at the overlook above the valley, he smiled. My father always believed nature rewards those who respect it. Daniel nodded, and Max reminded us of that. Henry knelt, carefully and gently placed a hand on the German shepherd's head. You didn't just save my life. You protected my father's legacy. Max simply wagged his tail. He had never searched for recognition. He had only followed his instincts. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Daniel removed the Special Service Medal from his pocket and clipped it onto Max's collar. You've earned this, partner. The German shepherd looked up at him with the same calm eyes that had guided him into the forgotten cave. Daniel smiled. Ready for tomorrow? Max barked once. It sounded almost like an answer. The two partners walked back toward their ranger truck as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the pine forest. Some stories end with treasure. Others end with fame. But the greatest adventures remind us that true heroes don't always speak. Sometimes they simply lead the way.